Yes.
Good evening, everyone in the Marshall Building and everyone on Zoom. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this special event, the launch of the book, Getting Schools to Work Better, Insights and Reflections from China and India by Dr. Yifei Yan. My name is Shuang Chen. I'm an assistant professor from the Social Policy Department of LSE, and I have the honor of chairing today's event. The event today is hosted by the LSE Fudan Global Public Policy Hub in collaboration with the School of Public Policy. And you can purchase the book by using the discount code on the flyers. And for those on Zoom, the flyers and the discount information on top are also shown on screen. So let me begin by introducing the author of the book, Dr. Yifei Yan. Dr. Yan is an assistant professor in public administration and public policy at the Department of Politics and International Relations, University of Southampton. She's also a former LSE fellow and a colleague of mine in the Social Policy Department. The book we're launching today builds on her doctoral dissertation, which won the 2019 Best PhD Dissertation Award from the Indian Public Policy Network. In addition to this new book, Dr. Yan's work has also appeared in journals such as International Review of Administrative Sciences and Policy Design and Practice. How do we get schools to work better? This is a question that concerns not only academics interested in educational accountability, but also policymakers around the world seeking solutions to improving education quality. In this book, Dr. Yan brought on mixed method fieldwork in India and China to answer this question in this book. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the star of today's event, Dr. Yifei Yan.
Thank you, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Sean. So I think the first thing that I want to say is it just feels really great to be coming back with this book. So this coming back, actually it can be understood in three different ways. So first is of course coming back to this specific location. So as Sean mentioned, so before joining the University of Southampton, I was based here in the Social Policy Department for 3 years. So it feels really great to be able to catch up with former colleagues. And secondly, I think the coming back is also in a temporal sense. Again, some of you may have heard of the term building back better. So which in the education policy context refers to achieving greater heights in the post-pandemic era. So I think writing and completing and publishing this first book of mine, I would also count this as my personal journey of building back better after overcoming all the challenges during the pandemic and also especially as an early career researcher. So in that, I always tell people that I feel it takes a village to get this book published. So in that sense, I'm really glad that some parts of this village, including my former mentor and I guess my current mentor is online, and also my friends since PhD days, are joining me tonight. So I think it's also feeling both gratified and also very humbled to have such an opportunity to thank all those people who have supported me through this event and of course through this book as well. And lastly, in an intellectual sense, and now I'm coming back to the content of the book. So making policy work, especially in those non-Western public administration contexts, has been a quite a consistent focus of my research. So my ongoing research project would move on to examine how the good education performance were achieved, similarly achieved in vastly different socioeconomic settings, such as Singapore, Estonia, and Brazil. So compared with this kind of like new venture, so to speak, I would always count the basic education systems in China and India as my intellectual starting point. And actually, well, again, as Sean mentioned, so the empirical part of the book is mostly built on my doctoral dissertation. So in that sense, I also feel like by writing the book, it's also a great opportunity for me to revisit some contents of the dissertation, but also update, elaborate, expand, and improve on some of the others, right? So now, what is this book really about? And also, why is there a need for such a book in the first place? Again, the starting point of also what we already know about is that getting schools to work better is both a global imperative as well as a global challenge. So the global imperative part, I think it's well reflected in the fourth Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG 4, that emphasizes quality and equitable education for all. But as I highlighted in chapter 1 of the book, is that compared with the very remarkable progress made in expanding schooling access and improving literacy rate, so the progress on raising student learning outcomes has been much slower, much less impressive, and also the results are more uneven. So this leads to some scholars in educational research to refer to this phenomenon as schooling aid learning, right? And so in making further sense of this puzzle, there's also like quite a lot of research already that focuses on a particular, and I would say the mainstream approach to making schools work, which is the accountability approach. So in that sense, I would say that this book is actually joining the this large literature in also in problematizing accountability. But I would also say that I also offered two key departures in this book, which is why in the concluding chapter, I referred to this as old bottle, but new one, right? So what kind of new wines am I offering, right? There are essentially two things. The first is in terms of how accountability in education can be reconceptualized. And secondly, using an original comparative case study of the government middle schools in Beijing and Delhi, I also talked a little bit about how this reconceptualized accountability in education can be designed to work. So I guess now you're probably expecting me to elaborate more specifically on how these two departures are made. But I'm well aware of the time that I was given to present the highlights of the book. But more importantly, I also don't want to give too much a spoiler to the extent of ruining the fun of reading, right? So that's why I decided to take a different approach. Again, I don't know how many of you have heard of, which is probably more a Chinese saying than English saying. So basically, there exists a southern Hamlet in a southern people's eyes. So not that I dare to compare my work with Shakespeare's, right? But I think like in writing this book, I did have in mind the audiences and the readership from the different disciplinary backgrounds and also the subject fields, right? So, well, let's say at least I prepared 3 different versions of Hamlet for 3 different types of readers. And by doing this, I'm actually also following the tradition from my grad schools, which Karen probably well remember, that starting from our former dean, that always emphasizes exactly 3 things in each public speaking. So before I bringing in like my 3 points, right? So a final caveat is that even though like these 3 points are, you can say that analytically separate, or maybe just separate for the sake of promoting this book, right? But essentially, I would say these 3 points are also interrelated, right? So in other words, I feel like I wouldn't feel surprised if like later on when you finish reading the book and then they come to me and say, hey, I actually think that all 3 points is related to my case or resonate with my case, right? So firstly, for readers who are interested in or familiar with educational research, right? I would intend this book as an invitation for you to think together with me how accountability in education can be conceptualized and also practiced differently. So as I mentioned earlier, that there is already a wide range of educational studies literature criticizing the mainstream accountability approach, right? They pointed out both the like performative nature of educational accountability and also a very narrow and a specific ways of like measuring this kind of performance, right? And also they even touched upon the kind of like very tension between accountability measures on one hand and also teachers, which I referred to in this book as the ultimate accounters, right? So, but building on that, the question still remains like what solutions can be offered if these kind of problems are recognized and diagnosed, right? So the solution that I offer in this book is mainly building upon the public administration literature. So essentially the underpinning here is that, or the key message here is that not all accountability are the same. And by saying that, I do not only mean that there are different types or even typologies of accountability, right? But more fundamentally, there's actually also different purposes of accountability. And the public administration literature highlighted three essential purposes. Well, again, I don't know whether this is a coincidence or not. So there are purposes of control, meaning that making sure that rules are followed and also like some key targets are met, right? And then there are purposes of assurance, right? Assuring that so all these governance practices and policy interventions do not deviate much from the creation of public value, right? And ultimately the purpose of improvement of the governance and also ultimately the policy outcomes. So building on that, if there is a diversity of the purposes of accountability, then I think it would be unreasonable to expect a single accountability measure or a single stone, if you wish, to kill all the birds or all the purposes, right? And also very importantly, just as a command and control measure may be more appropriate for fulfilling the control and assurance purposes, so I argue in this book that the institutionalized support, and especially this kind of support for frontline workers such as teachers, are also indispensable for the purpose of improvement. So that is the main takeaway that I would intend for the those readers interested in educational research. And secondly, for the readers who are interested in or maybe familiar with the public policy and especially the policy design literature, I also hope this book would be both an interesting, relevant, but also timely and fresh example from the education policy sector in advancing this literature. So the reason why this matters is because currently, like in the literature, like the cases, either the revelatory case or like illustrated case or critical cases that are used to advance the policy design literature, either mostly come from, for example, the environmental policy, or if it's in the social policy realm, like there's a lot being written about healthcare policy, right? So in that case, I think the value added of this book is, again, following what I mentioned earlier. So if there are like multiple means of accountability that are needed in order to fill the multiple and diverse purposes, right? And then through both the literature review and also through my original exploratory case study of how such support is practiced and perceived on the ground in India and China, right? I also highlighted two essential conditions for individual accountability mechanisms to work, right? Both in the sense that they need to be catering to the needs or the incentives of the policy targets and key stakeholders. And they will need to, like, say, ensure that there are enough capacity of the key stakeholders to fulfill the designated ends. right? So yeah, and also in addition to thinking about how to make how accountability measures can be designed to work individually, I also offered in later parts of the book how these different accountability measures or instruments can be coordinated and orchestrated to work collectively. So I think this is the second key message that I would like to highlight. And last but not least, I think the book also has something to offer for readers who are interested in understanding China and India, right? So the hope is that the book also offers some more in-depth and nuanced understanding of the two of the world's largest basic education systems. So if you think about China and India, perhaps like 1 decade or 2 decades ago, right? The usual image that would be triggered is those of them as emerging economies, right? As captured in the acronym BRICS, right? So the 5 emerging economies. And nowadays, I mean, if you talk about China and India, I think it's the impression is probably much stronger for them as geopolitical powers and also geopolitical rivals. So apart from these two stereotypical images, right? So some readers may be more familiar with the policy making and developmental challenges in China, and some readers may be more familiar with India, right? So what I'm trying to do in this book is to present a portrait of both of them together at once, and also of those countries just as large developing countries, right? And also to highlight what are the kind of either similar or different like development challenges that they are facing, and then also what kind of similar or different policy solutions that they are endeavoring to arrange. So in doing so, I think the book would offer a transcendence, or at least a complement to the two stereotypical image of, let's say, economic growth superstar or geopolitical rival and a superpower, right? And I think this learning is important not only for the other developing countries who might find either the Chinese experience and or the Indian experience useful, right? But this kind of learning, I would say, it's also very important for the two countries themselves. So for some readers, and I would indeed imagine that for many readers from these two countries, right, it will be a very far-fetched idea to think about learning from each other. So in that case, I think and genuinely hope that this book will at least provide a valuable starting point and also a good knowledge base for these two countries to at least start to think more about learning about each other, right? So yeah, I think these are the essential 3 of the highlights, and there are probably more, right? But just to summarize a little bit here, I think coming back to the first point that I made, in the sense that getting schools to work better is really also a global challenge. So that's why I would say that even though most of the empirical parts of the book is building on the like the contextual findings from China and India, but as I mentioned earlier, many of the points I would say that applies to many other countries, both developing countries, but also a lot of the developed countries are facing some similar issues. So I hope that like this the lessons that is derived from this book and also the theoretical insights. So yeah, I hope that's gonna be either immediately useful or like if not, at least it's gonna serve as a very good starting point to continue to research on this important topic.
Thanks, Dr. Yan. Next, we will hear from our discussant today, Dr. Mubarak Hossain, who is an assistant professor in the LSE Social Policy Department. Please welcome Mubarak.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yifei. It's a great honor and to be a discussant of this book. So a special honor, I have to say, because I worked on accountability in education issue at the global level when I was working with UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report in 2017, and it was about accountability in education. And that was effectively the time that I started thinking about accountability. But I have to say, the book really brings together the ideas from different disciplines, especially public administration and education. So it's really perfect diffusion of two different disciplines. And as I really don't have a lot to add to what Yifei mentioned about the book from the author itself. So, but yeah, I wanted to highlight as an external reader, but not by giving some spoiler. I wouldn't give any spoiler. So we'll try to keep it a bit nuanced, let's say. So the book really defines accountability in a very new way. So all the way to define, or my understanding of accountability is just mostly punitive way of seeing accountability measure, like so holding teachers accountable for not coming to class, teachers accountable to students, to parents, schools accountable to students' parents. So this traditional way of saying like, why didn't you do this? And then you have to get punished. So very mundane way of thinking accountability, but book really takes it to the next level. So I was joking, I gave the name it like superlative accountability. The way it is understood. Not only because it's defined in a way, I'm not gonna give the spoiler again, how it is defined, but also contextualizing in the context of Beijing and Delhi, or China and India, I mean, understandably representing world majority. So the way accountability is often understood in the context of education, it really comes from very Western-centric literature, thinking accountability from perspective of the school autonomy. So, for example, if you make schools more autonomous, they will have all the power to hold all the actors accountable, holding students accountable for their results, for their homework, and parents accountable for not really communicating school instructions well with their children, etc. So this is very traditional way, and I think this and implementing this kind of notion of accountability in the context of or less or resources scarce context is really quite challenging, because resource makes everything quite different. So the way accountability might work in traditional sense that schools are more autonomous because schools have resources to be autonomous, to bring actors to the table. But when you don't have enough resources, public schools are really reliant on access on central government's resources, right? Partly, but also then you would have to also collect fees to keep to make sure that the quality of education is up to the point. That resource scarcity makes it a bit different. The way to make sure accountability works in education, and then the book really brings this point to the core, that why context should matter, and then why accountability should be defined in an organic way, not taking existing definition from another context. And also the study does not only compare accountability in Indian and Chinese context theoretically, but also it brings some of the measures that are contextual to Delhi and then Beijing context. So the measures, how accountability is measured, is different in India and in China. So again, there is no attempt to universalize that definition of accountability, even within the context of Global South. So I have to say that this really doesn't exist. So in this way, the book is really original. So people who are really interested in education issue in general, and specific to accountability, school autonomy, and also the politics of education, the book would be a really good introduction. and especially if you're interested in education in the global South. I enjoyed reading many chapters, but specifically, I was really yeah, I wouldn't give any spoiler, but yeah, I was again like I was really convinced with how the definition of accountability in education is operationalized empirically and in many different ways. So there is not just one single indicator, this is accountability or not. So there are many ways. Accountability in terms of what it means when you support your colleagues, teachers, or schools in general, what it means when you don't support. So there are multiple angles. So accountability is not just understood here in one sense. So it's very comprehensive definition. There is empirical data, a lot of empirical data. And I hope the readers will enjoy as I did. But I wanted to also add something. I mean, it's hard to link it, what can be done in the future without, of course, detailing the results. But yeah, again, the spoiler issue is there. So yeah, so but what I thought the scholars in this field could do in the future, taking this book to the next level, or in the future, as testing this accountability, the definition of accountability and the measures in other contexts. Can be in the mega city context, can be within China. I think the education, there's huge regional variation within China, within India. So we can test whether these measures work within Chinese context, within India's context, and also across different countries. So this, I think the book also highlights the importance of South-South cooperation. So we can see, I mean, this is really good introduction, how, like, the comparison could be made even within using different heuristics, but how we can see how it can be replicated in other context. So yeah, again, so it's really convincing the case. I'm really honored, like, to come here and be a discussant and share some of the findings without not really sharing. Thank you so much again for the opportunity.
Yifei, would you like to respond to Mubarak and maybe give us a little bit?
Yes, I think, yeah, on the one hand, so again, there's always a balance issue, right? Because on the one hand, you want to reserve all the joy and the fun of reading, like, as much as to the readers. But on the other hand, I think it's probably also, well, sometimes like, necessary just to utilize some of the contents, right, in order to make the points. So I just probably first to pick up on Mubarak's point in terms of what can be done in the future, right? So I think it's both an exciting idea, but also, well, like, again, I think depending on what kind of data that you're collecting and also what are the other requirements, I would say that it's probably also a little bit challenging as well. I mean, well, again, depending on the specific context. So the reason why I would say that it would be exciting is that actually the reason why I picked up Delhi and Beijing as the two cases of my empirical focus. So I think that is mentioned in the appendix chapter. So basically it's because that like, if I want to have some indicators, especially in terms of, well, first of all, there's no cross-country like comparable data. So in the sense that I can't use whatever that, like, so I'm studying the middle school level, right? I can't use the student results at the middle level in China to compare with that with India, right? That just simply doesn't make sense. And also, I think another thing that you mentioned, keywords you mentioned, is the resources, right? So both China and India, like, if you're familiar with, is like vastly internally diverse, right? So in that case, so if let's say, compare, and also essentially, if we just look at the data at the national level, right? So I just to give one example, right? So by the time that I conducted the field work, so if you look at the Indian national data, there's one category of schools that is like one classroom schools, right? So indicating the level of a lack of resource of the schools in some of the very backward states in India, right? But somehow, like given the like historically speaking, like we can say that part of like India's underdevelopment in terms of basic education outcomes is also like historically, unlike China, which kind of emphasized the importance of basic education ever since the establishment of PRC, right? For a very long time, like under the development planning, so India always gave the priority to higher education, right? So the focus on the basic education wouldn't come up until 1986, right? Which is like decades after India got independence. But in any case, so like for by the time of the like when I looked at the national picture of both countries, right? Those kind of one classroom schools just rarely exist in the Chinese context because of the like of course there are many other problems that applies to the Chinese context would probably not find counterparts in India. So in any case, I think in the end, the reason for selecting Delhi and Beijing as a starting point is given that, okay, like relatively abundant resources are given to the education sector in general, and also for supporting teachers more specifically, right? So I guess like coming back to your furthering comparative study part, I think the benefits of focusing on a single country is that you would like from the availability of data, like from that perspective, right? You can say that internally coherent and internally comparable data would be more available as compared with like comparing like across the country, right? But then I think the other point, so on the one hand, like more rich comparison can be done like within the different countries, but on the other hand, like what is happening on those accountability scenarios and also in teacher support for other developing countries, I think it's equally like the availability of existing research is equally in short supply to like cover that as well. But I think another aspect that I did touch upon a little bit in the book is also from the chronological perspective, right? So, well, as you know, that this comes from my doctoral dissertation, and well, let's say I'm already away from my doctoral years for a while, right? So that is why you can well imagine. So yeah, I actually acknowledge this as a limitation of the data as well. But at least partially compensate for that limitation, but also because I was aware, like by the time I was in field work, and actually both sides have some education reforms ongoing, right? So I also made a point to like when writing the book is that, okay, I also want to figure out like what are the latest education reforms there, and especially in the empirical parts that I'm interested in. So I think, again, just to summarize very briefly, right? I think there are a few interesting and also I would count this as improvements going on in both sides. But on the other hand, so in that sense, it's like updating some of the research findings in the book, right? However, I also mentioned a little bit other aspects, especially in terms of like how some of the key reforms are really catering to the needs of the teachers, and how and to what extent teachers are included as a stakeholder within the policy design process, right? So here I'm referring to the double reduction policy in China, and some of you may be familiar with that. So building on those kind of aspects, I would say that instead of undermining the conclusion and the findings that is made in a previous period, it's actually reinforcing some of my best messages. So I think, yeah, that's the further thoughts triggered by so.
That's great. Now we'll open up the floor and take questions from the audience, both in the Marshall Building and online.
There's a question.
Daniel, and I think it was about 20 years ago. I read a small book by a Filipino journalist about education in the Philippines, and the book was called Robbed, and the subtitle involves corruption. So I'm wondering if your term accountability is in any way related to corruption.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you for this question. And I think, well, like for public administration in general, right? So like when we talk about accountability, and especially I think more associated with explicitly associated with the control and assurance purposes, right? Accountability is indeed often talked together with corruption. But like in terms of how the empirical part of my, the empirical part of my book cover the aspects of corruption, and then the answer is no. I think that also it's because of the specific data that I'm collecting, right? So basically, the empirical focus of the book, as mentioned earlier, is about how teacher support is practiced and perceived on the ground, right? And the reason for that, for that focus is that if we are to, like as Marwan commented, if we are to take accountability as a like very holistic idea, right? And then figure out how accountability is actually practiced and whether it worked or not on the ground, right? So the key argument I think made at the end of chapter 2 is that compared as our empirical knowledge on like whether the what I call traditional accountability measures work or not, right? So for example, there's reach studies and sometimes also systematic literature reviews on whether autonomy worked or not as an accountability measure, privatization, etc., right? And but there's not much say like stock taking in terms of how the institutionalized support for teacher work from an accountability lens, right? So this is what's justified my focus, like using the survey, using survey methods and interviews, and also like a bunch of secondary data to figure out how teacher support is actually practiced and perceived. So within this kind of nature of data that I'm collecting, right, I actually wasn't able to touch much and also like very meaningfully touching upon the issue of corruption.
Thanks, Eve. Well, I can just talk loud. Sorry, I'll just talk loud. Thanks, Yifei. That was really interesting. I had the privilege of reading one of the chapters in advance, and it's very beautifully written, and it's a very compelling read. So I'm going to butter you up then by getting to the next part, which is I need spoilers. I need some more spoilers.
I guess one place to start would actually be with these two concepts of accountability, educational accountability and teacher support. Because in some respects, just as a complete layperson who has no background in education other than being an educator, I tend to think that these two can actually be opposed to each other, right? That systems, governing systems would really seek to hold education providers to account, but not actually give them the support that they need. And so that while they should work together, they can actually work opposed to each other. So here's the request for spoilers. Could you tell us a little bit more about these two ideas, not just separate, but how do they interact together in your cases?
Yeah, that's a very good and also very important question, because the kind of like juxtaposition of these education accountability and teacher support, like putting them against each other, I think is exactly what the existing literature is doing, right? Which is what explains why when which is also critiqued by the literature already, right? So basically, like when teachers are thinking about accountability, right, the impression would be like embarrassingly negative, right? In a sense that which, as I mentioned earlier, the teachers are always treated as the ultimate accounter, right? Which no matter what kind of generations we are talking about, whether it's the traditional public administration generation or later on, like when starting with the Western world, but also traveled around the world, the new public management, right? So basically, like bringing in more market accountability, social accountability, right? It's almost inversely like unidimensional, in which like teachers are the ones being held accountable, right? So I think the way and which, as the literature rightly highlights, it's unhealthy and also unhelpful, right? So one way to break away from this unidimensional, avoiding treating the teachers as the ultimate accounter is by going back to, so here's how I engage the public administration literature coming in, right? So basically, like to recognize that there is actually not only a diversity of the means of accountability, like whatever kind of accountability measures that are being used, but more fundamentally, like taking a step back, there are actually also multiple purposes for accountability, right? So basically, and then there is actually a very sophisticated theorization of kind of what kind of policy instruments would be more suitable under what conditions, right? But essentially speaking, one accountability measure that has been talked a lot, right, which is the either the regulation or inspections, etc., right? So as mentioned earlier, so these kind of measures would probably be more suitable like when that the inspectors or like the policymakers so have enough capacity to like really figure out like say the improvement purposes, right? But then in reality that actually doesn't happen, right? So one example that I mentioned is that, okay, so if we want to make a regulation to encourage or even like force parents to send the children to school, right? Basically as a way to fulfilling the compulsory education, right? So is this goal straightforward? Yes, like it's relatively easy to understand, right? And also the criteria could be consistent like across the different contexts within a country, right? And is it easy to detect? Yes, provided that if you have a good data infrastructure to locate, like who is sending the kids to school or not, right? Which is why, like some of the existing literature are using this to explain why the regulatory measures worked for China to enforce this compulsory education, right? But now thinking in a different kind of like a scenario, right? So if we want to make a regulation to enforce good education, right? Or like enforce some kind of good practices, right? So where do you even start with, right? So one way that the Indian legislator started with, right, is to make sure that, okay, like apart from the infrastructure, we also need to, okay, have a specific, let's say, teacher-student ratio or something like that, right? And also other kind of like ideal features that is in the legislator's minds imposed in the Right to Education Act. And then the question that you can ask is this really an appropriate measure in a sense of like, how do you really account for the vastly different contextual realities in different parts of the country, right? So in that sense, so that serves as an illustration that maybe regulatory measures are less suitable for you to achieve the improvement purposes, like within the accountability package, right? And then the next question is like, if not like regulatory measures, and then what, right? So the reason why the support to teachers, and also not just in the financial sense of like performance pay, right? But also like say in constant and institutionalized in-service training, but also the career development, right? Is that many of the things that from a policy makers level, you cannot specify, right? But somehow can still be reached. If, for example, right, when the promoted teachers, which means that the teacher's professional capacity is already recognized by the system, right? So when these promoted teachers are invited back to serve as like trainer, right? So in that case, I mean, even if I tell nothing in the regulation about what teacher training should look like, right? But through this kind of like in-person and intense interactions, so these are one way in which the improvement purposes can achieve, right? So that coming back to the point that I mentioned earlier is that multiple accountability measures needs to exist, but also needs to be coordinated with one another to make sure that the multiple purposes of accountability is also achieved.
I mean, I can drive us off the mic as well. Thank you very much. I mean, it's a bit difficult given that you don't want to give away spoilers to actually have like an in-depth discussion of what you're arguing.
Too much. Apologies for that.
But I think, I mean, one of the points you made was, I guess, to say that we are now moving from the question of access to the question of quality. And it seems to me like quite trivial to say that you can monitor access quite well. You can see whether there is a school building, but you cannot really monitor quality very well because you would have to know what is happening in a classroom. And obviously that then has an impact on accountability. And it seems to me quite obvious that a better teacher support system is good. But that doesn't tell me anything about how can a country like India achieve this. The other thing I was struggling with, what you were telling us, you were focusing on Delhi and Beijing. Now, if I think about Delhi, and if I compare it to Bihar or Uttar Pradesh in India, that to me seem like very different worlds. Like, I mean, if I'm the education secretary in Delhi, I can travel to any school within an hour or 2 hours. If I'm sitting in Patna, Bihar, and I have a huge state, I can't do that. So I'm just wondering, how much does focusing on 2 capital cities really tell us about insights for China or for India? If I'm a policymaker, I would probably feel like not so much.
Yeah, thanks for both questions. So the first, so regarding the first question, how can a country like India achieve, have good practices about teacher support, right? Again, I think, so in terms of the, I think the second question actually refers to some of the issue about generalizability that Mark discussed earlier, right? In which sense that I think I mentioned very explicitly in chapter 3 that it's not going to be generalizable in a sense of, let's say, whatever I discussed about Beijing and Delhi, and then you can freely apply it to, I don't know, the backward states in India and also like backward provinces in China, right? But like I'm coming again to the first question is that the answer is actually provided in the empirical chapters. So I had a separate chapter of how teacher support is practiced and perceived in Beijing, and then a separate chapter in Delhi, right? So if you started to read that particular chapter, which I think is chapter 4, the impression is probably less about how can, not how a country like India, right? But how the government middle schools in Delhi were probably less about how they manage to do things well, right? But I actually pointed out, and also later on analyzed from a policy design perspective, so which are the area like they are actually doing less well, right, by the stage of the field work. So I think like by reading that chapter, it's probably gonna address the first question. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not only just a snapshot, right? There are also kind of like chronological aspects to that. And that links you to chapter 7, like the concluding chapter, and especially the section 7.2, which actually follows up on some of the latest reforms that the Delhi government has brought in terms of supporting teachers. And then you can clearly see that some of the earlier deficits was filled, right, But on the other hand, there are also some other the aspects, the deficits that are being filled include, for example, moving slightly away from a top-down approach of like a very dictating way of like imposing teacher training towards having more kind of like mid-range intermediary, let's say, like between the state government and also teachers, right? So that the teachers' needs can be better communicated and the challenges discussed. So that's the positive development that I discovered in Delhi, and also like through the many other countries, right? Many other states. I'm not aware of Bihar, but at least I think the other AAP states are also trying to like learn from Delhi's experience. So maybe like if you follow some of the research on that front, you can also see like I wouldn't say that it's gonna happen like all at one go, right? But slowly, the positive lessons from Delhi are being kind of like I wouldn't say diffused, right? But at least the other state governments are aware of that, right? So that's the current status in terms of answering the first question, right? And the second question, well, again, as I mentioned earlier, right? So I wouldn't say that the lessons, well, some part of the lessons, you're right, maybe not directly transferable to other poorer states in both India and China. But I think the phenomenon that you mentioned, right, it's probably, well, on the one hand, you can say that in Delhi, it's indeed much more advanced, and the government are paying attention to the education sector. But the example you mentioned, like say traveling 2 hours to school, right? I actually experienced that like myself when I was doing field work, right? So like more specifically, my field district in Delhi is North Delhi, which is not like say compares with the more advanced or poshy part in central Delhi or southwest Delhi. Well, I'm not gonna bore you with the geography in Delhi, right? But relatively speaking, an average district, which I intentionally chose because I want to compare that with also an quite average district in Beijing as well. So one of the schools I visited, right, which is like, I think that's the legend of my entire field trip. So basically like so from where I am, where I was staying, which is already based within North Delhi, right? So I think like 45 minutes by metro, and then like waiting for like 20 or 30 minutes for a tuk-tuk, and then tuk-tuk took me like further 30 minutes to the place where like it's really like middle of nowhere, and then I don't even know how to name that. It's not a tuk-tuk, and it's also not a cycle rickshaw, and I don't even know like how to call it, right? So I bumped the last like 30 minutes in order to finally get that school, right? And also, well, that's my personal experience. And also from my respondents, right, the survey that I did with teachers, right, actually one of the complaints about this kind of top-down like imposition of in-service training is so the location of the most of the like in-service training providers, right? It's located in central Delhi. So basically it's an organization called SERT. Whereas North Delhi, like even in the best case scenario, right? It's probably like 45 minutes to travel one way and then going back, right? So for the school that I mentioned that I traveled probably, I don't know, like 1 hour and a half or 2 hours, right? It's even more a logistic nightmare for them, right? Which is why, like compared with that, so compared with this kind of scenarios, you see that it actually imposes less burden on teachers, even just the logistic burdens, right? If the training can somehow be either the district centered, or even better, like located at the school level, right? So this is not a trivial point because that like there are some improvement. I mean, I wish I have done that research, right? But I had the point is that I haven't been to field for like really in long enough time as the time I spent during the field work. But other researchers have gone back to Delhi, I think during pandemic time, which the AAP's teacher development program are still like going on well, right? one of the things that teachers appreciated the most, right? You wouldn't imagine that. So it's actually like the teachers were saying that, oh, nowadays, like we sit in a proper classroom and with proper chairs and like with waters and like meals provided to us, right? So we finally feel that we are treated properly, like within this like in-service training, right? So in that case, I think these kind of like small things and also together with the contents that you provide, right, would really make a difference in terms of, let's say, catering to the teacher's needs, both like the needs in a very basic sense, but also the kind of professional development. Right. I think I answered the question.
Hi, Lilia and Hiro from UFRN Brazil. Firstly, I would like to congratulate the author on the publication of the book, which addresses a topic of special relevance in education policy. My question is, as the world experiences an intense movement of political polarization, visible in Europe and the US, but also preeminent in countries of the global south, such as Brazil, how do you assess that this political polarization affects accountability 3.0, especially in the field of education? That's the first question. We have another one, but maybe you want to answer that.
I see. Well, first of all, thanks for the question from Hiro and Lydia, which by the way is actually my co-authors. So yeah, but I think that is also it's a very important question, but it's also like a very big question, I would say, right? Because again, like if we are to bring in the the context of like different places in the global south, right? So we would say, we would see that, again, I think the question, but the caveat is that I haven't really done a lot of research in that area, but I would say that it would essentially depends on how this polarization is has penetrated through the education policy sector, right? So again, I wouldn't be able to, let's say, for example, answer the question in the Brazilian context because I'm yet to learn more about the Brazilian context from you guys. But I think like just in the case of India and especially in the case of Delhi, right? So a lot of, so I think this is something that I mentioned in chapter 7, like in the follow-up part. So the reason or the main challenges why a lot of the reform measures hasn't been like implemented as according to the wish of the policymaker, right? So instead of any, like it's really a more political hurdle as compared with the administrative hurdle, right? So basically one example here is that this is another key difference between between Beijing and Delhi, in the sense that, well, even though China had this phenomenon called not surrogate, but something like a guest teacher or contract teacher, right? Mainly in the rural areas and back maybe in the 1990s, right? So in Chinese, we call 代课教师, right? So this kind of phenomenon was more or less like diminished over time with the infrastructural upgrade, etc. So in that, so at least for the schools that I visited in the field work, so most of them are regular teachers, meaning that the teachers like on a regular contract, right? But the situation in India and in Delhi, but also in many other states, is that in addition to the regular teachers, which like according to the Indian system, like they belong to the civil service, but on the other hand, there is this category called contract teachers, right? Contract teachers get paid on the, like say, daily wages and sometimes monthly wages, depending on which categories they are talking about, but also their pay is based on whether like they attended or like delivered a particular class on that day, right? Which actually in the accountability literature, like they were cited as a useful and effective accountability measure, right? But anyways, but if you look at the other researches that is conducted by on the contract teachers, and especially if you're seeking to understand the perspective from the contract teachers themselves, right? So that's obviously a very stressful situation, and which elicits a lot of complaint, because essentially like they are earning less without any substantive differences in terms of the tasks that they are playing versus the regular teachers are playing, as highlighted like in the empirical parts of my book as well. So basically, like say the current Delhi government has sought to like resolve this issue by both regularizing the contract teachers, but also like say improving their status, etc. So I think part of them, like they were able to achieve that purposes. But the main thing where they get stuck is because, let's say, because they are like also between this incumbent party and the opposition party, right? So there's a lot of like political turf wars going on there. So yeah, I think that is one closest example that I can think about, that in my book, like the part that I touches on the role of political influence. And I think like I very frankly acknowledged in the paper that I don't entirely have a solution for this kind of political stalemate. But the only thing that I can suggest is, again, like if you think about accountability as instead of like one monolithic thing, but instead as like many like different and a diverse set of measures, right? So I would say that like if this kind of administrative solution are not able to be achieved immediately, right? Meaning that guest teachers cannot be regularized just immediately or at once, right? But it doesn't mean that the government should not think about more, like say the support in terms of in-service training, and also like for in-service training to start with, right? To support those kind of guest teachers rather than excluding them, as what I have shown in my survey, at least during the previous period, right? So yeah, I think that's pretty much the answer I can give. But maybe, yeah, I wonder you guys if you have any further thoughts on this question.
No question. No, I think she asked if you have any thoughts on the question. No. Okay. A question from Elizabeth Evans. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Did your research uncover any gendered patterns in terms of ways in which teachers are supported, or ways in which accountability is approached or understood?
Yeah. Oh, well, thanks so much for this question, Liz. And I think like maybe the broad answer is that unfortunately I haven't covered enough the gender dimension, like by the time that I conducted that research. But I definitely, so that is definitely something that I look forward to, like so in terms of furthering this agenda of accountability research, right? But I think like one thing, well, it's not something documented like in the research or like in the book, but I think just based on like a layperson perspective, if you wish, just based on the observation of how the support to teachers has been improved over time in the case of Delhi, for example. I think the quite distinctive feature that I noticed is like in the current government's support to teacher development. So one thing that they did is, well, there's something called a mentor teacher program, right? And then together with a teacher development coordinator that covers the different aspects of the in-service training in Delhi. So I think like based on my experience of attending some of the sessions, and also if I just look at the teacher profile, like mentor teacher profile online, I think what the current government is doing a quite good job, at least just based on this limited experience, is that there seems to be quite a good gender balance, in the sense that like I see a mixture of female teachers and male teachers like discussing things together. I think in contrast to any gender differences, but one thing that, well, again, that's beyond the empirical part of the book, but the thing is that I also did some kind of principal surveys or school surveys in the more so in the Indian context, but also like in the Chinese context as well. But the major difference that I found is that unlike China, like in which the head teacher is always the principal, right? So the main figure. Whereas in India, like in Delhi, or at least at that time, there's only like very limited number of what like the like the main principal or the full principal, right? But who is really in charge of the school at that time is holding the position of vice principal. So it's again like a kind of dualism like that we observed between the guest teachers versus regular teachers, right? So again, there is this kind of difference is like within the governance structure. So in terms of two different category or rankings of principals, but essentially doing the same thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just thinking, because you have mentioned a couple of times the important role of the Aadmi Party in Delhi. There are also some schools under the MCD which come under the central government. So I was just wondering whether you have also surveyed teachers who are in MCD schools and compared sort of their experiences, as they were not so much affected by the Aadmi Party reforms. The other thing I would say is that you probably know it, but Yamini Iyer and colleagues at CPR have also made a quite interesting ethnographic study in a school, because they actually spend a lot of time when these Aadmi reforms happened to see how sort of the reforms from the top state leadership are trickling down in the school. And that often led to a lot of confusion and a lot of difficulties in actually implementing them. So I was just wondering whether you have any experiences on this as well.
I don't know why I was somehow expecting the microphone as well. So probably I was just listening to the questions too attentively. So the first question, like whether I covered MCD schools or like KD, right? So that's the acronym. I forgot what's the full name in Hindi. So these two kind of schools, I didn't, well, I mentioned them, but I didn't cover in my empirical research, because the empirical focus is on government middle schools, right? So middle schools are the level that is, like say, directly taken care by the state government, whereas MCDs, because of the decentralization trend, right? So MCD, MCD schools, which means that MCD, the municipal city, the municipal corporation of Delhi is mainly taking care of the primary schools, right? So well, because of the nature of the schools that I'm studying, so I didn't include the MCD schools. And the KV, as you mentioned earlier, because KV is like, say, taken care by the central government, right? So again, it's beyond the scope of the book. But one comment that I can offer is that well, partly maybe it's for the sake of curiosity, but also like in terms of the school premises, right? So in practice, like you would find at least some schools in which the government schools or the DOE schools, so to speak, the Department of Education schools are located together with the MCD schools, right? So I have the opportunity to visit a few MCD schools, so like during the field work. So I think the only thing that I remember is that compared with how the middle schools or the DOE schools are taken care of, this is probably like even like in a lesser level. And also the other thing that I noticed that this is by like looking at the secondary data, is that because of the administrative separation, right? There's barely any kind of like policy coordination between the primary level and the secondary level, to the extent that, well, again, like you may say that the intention behind this policy is good, that the like the current government, I think they have launched this summer camp, I think since the year that I was doing the field work. So the summer camp, the intention of this policy is to, as I'll kind of warm up, right, to make sure that the graduates from the primary level are able to move up to the level in order to receive the education at the secondary level, right? So, I mean, the intention, like from this kind of interpretation, it's nothing wrong. But then again, like if you just go to interview teachers, right? The specific design of this kind of like policy, right? So because it's kind of like taking during the summer break, so it kind of intrudes the teacher's summer holiday. Whereas, like say, if they need to ask for leave, like say the leave that they are supposed to have, right? So this policy, like either accidentally or intentionally, like eaten away parts of that, right? So that was the complaints over that time. But so I think like another improvement that has been made on that front is that in addition to this kind of summer camp kind of connection, right? I did spot some of the policy documents, like maybe specifying how the connection between MCD and a DOE can be made stronger, right? But since since that's beyond my scope, I didn't delve that in depth into this particular document. But again, I think the other good thing is, so if you look at, again, another major development, which is the National Education Policy, published in 2020. And so the reason why I mentioned the date is because the last round of the National Economic Policy is, National Education Policy is published in 86, right? So you count the large interval between these two. But anyway, so I think one innovation that is mentioned in the curriculum structure is that they are trying to tighten the connections between the different levels, right? So at least I guess that is another good message, maybe from the national level. But in terms of how this can like really happen, again, it's like another different question yet to be figured out. So the ethnography from the CPR and the accountability initiative, I'm glad that you mentioned that. So I was actually a visiting scholar at CPR, like in order to finish this field work. So that gives me an opportunity to like thank them, and because I like really learned a lot, and also there's a lot of logistical facilitation. And in terms of the report on the ethnography research that you mentioned, I think that is also a major source for me to learn about the recent developments, given that I myself am not able to like spend long enough time in the field ever since the field.
So I'm going to use my privilege as the chair to ask you a question. Just coincidentally, maybe not so coincidentally, I think yesterday the teacher recruitment and retention crisis was on the news, on the UK news, on BBC. So obviously a lot of the challenges and the concerns are not limited to Delhi and Beijing. So what would you say to readers maybe from outside China and India? What do you think are some lessons they can take away from reading a book?
Yes, thanks so much for this question, which gives an opportunity for me to jump into the British context, right? Because in addition to this current crisis, I think like what is probably even more shocking is a head teacher in Reading actually committed suicide upon hearing the results from Ofsted, which is the inspection agency here, right? So like ranking her school as like inadequate, right? So I think I explicitly referred to this like very tragic example in the book, and also both to highlight that this is not, even though most of the empirical part is from India and China, but if we look at just like originally from like say the crisis in accountability and also a lot of the problems in accountability in education, it's actually not just confined to China or India or the global south, right? So in that sense, I would say that well, I see the value of both of the theoretical part because because of so many things that is happening in the global north as well. So I think that kind of like a holistic way in which the accountability in education can be conceptualized differently would offer both like some food for thought. And also like actually like if the policymakers wish, right, this can be a very goodwill leverage, right, to get like whoever that was opposed to these kind of some policy narratives on accountability in like instead of like say continuing to push them as opposers, but incorporate them, understand them as a key stakeholder, and then like maybe build a more inclusive dialogue on this. So I think this is the theoretical contribution and insights that I think policymakers from the global north can leverage. And also, I think in terms of the empirical parts, some parts in the global north might say, oh, hey, this kind of like, say, lack of resources and other kind of like resource-related issues might not be relevant to us, but who knows, right? And like nowadays, like the whole world is entering into this kind of like more or less, right? So less resources, but like the demands keep growing, right? But on the other hand, I think given the benefits of a diverse case study, like comparing China and India, right? So you actually also see a diverse kind of a trajectory and the directions and also the records of when the things are going well, like what from a teacher's perspective, what are exactly the things they like versus when the things are goes wrong, like what are things that they dislike, right? So this kind of like, even so the specific like training design might be very specific to a specific context. But I think the policymakers from the other contexts may well resonate and reflect, okay, so this kind of reason of dissatisfaction, would I imagine that to exist in my in-service training as well, right? So I think like, again, this kind of like the triggering of this kind of reflection is, again, I would say a source of change as well.
Okay, as we draw this book launch to a close, I'd like to thank Yifei Mubarak and our audiences for a rich discussion today. Again, I encourage you to read the book to delve more into our insights and discussion today. Particularly, I think the publisher has made one chapter free, and of course, you can also use the discount code on the flyers and on top of the screen to get a hard copy or an electronic copy if you're interested. So thank you everyone for your presence, and thanks to the organizers from the LSE Fudan Global Public Policy Hub and the School of Public Policy. I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you.